June 11th, 1962, 9:30 p.m. The most secure prison in America had settled into its nightly silence. But in cell block B, in cell 138, Bumpy Johnson wasn't sleeping. His eyes were fixed on the concrete ceiling above, his ears tuned to every sound echoing through the corridors, his fingers methodically turning a small piece of metal between his weathered hands. Tonight, the most famous prison escape in American history would unfold. And there was one truth the FBI would never discover. This breakout was the culmination of Bumpy Johnson's meticulously crafted 18-month master plan. For half a century, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has searched for answers. They've written thousands of pages of reports, interrogated hundreds of witnesses, and chased leads across 3 continents. But none of them knew the real story. The Alcatraz escape wasn't planned from the outside looking in. It was orchestrated from within the belly of the beast itself. And the man pulling the strings was Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed king of Harlem, who continued running his empire even from behind the bars of America's most infamous prison. The story I'm about to share with you today doesn't appear in any official FBI files. It's not taught in criminology courses at Quantico. It's never been featured in those glossy true crime documentaries that flood cable television. Why? Because the truth was too uncomfortable, too unthinkable for federal authorities to acknowledge a black gangster had outsmarted their most secure facility and made the U.S. government look like amateurs. But the reality is this: the 1962 Alcatraz breakout wasn't just 3 desperate convicts chasing a dream of freedom. It was Bumpy Johnson's final and most spectacular demonstration of power, a chess move so brilliant that it continues to confound investigators 6 decades later. Are you ready to hear this story? Because what you're about to learn will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about the Alcatraz legend. Back in 1951, when Bumpy Johnson first set foot on Alcatraz Island, he was already a legend walking among mere mortals. The king of Harlem, the mastermind behind the numbers racket that put millions of dollars into black hands during the Depression. A man who had survived 4 decades on the meanest streets in America by being smarter, more ruthless, and infinitely more strategic than anyone who dared challenge him. But Alcatraz, this was different territory entirely. This wasn't the familiar concrete jungle of 125th Street where Bumpy's word was law. This was a barren rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by frigid waters and patrolled by guards who didn't care about your reputation on the outside. Here, money couldn't buy you protection, connections couldn't get you favors, threats couldn't intimidate your enemies, or so everyone believed. During those first weeks, Bumpy Johnson did what he'd always done best. He watched, he listened, and he learned. While other inmates spent their days complaining about the cold, the food, and the impossible security, Bumpy was conducting reconnaissance. He studied the guards' routines, noting who worked double shifts and why. He observed which inmates had influence and which ones were merely surviving. He memorized the prison's daily rhythms like a conductor learning a complex symphony. Most importantly, he identified the system's vulnerabilities. Because Bumpy Johnson had learned something during his 4 decades in the criminal underworld that the federal authorities never quite grasped. There is no such thing as an unbreakable system. Every fortress has its weak points. Every chain has its most fragile link. Every empire, no matter how mighty, has cracks that can be exploited by someone patient and clever enough to find them. By the winter of 1959, Bumpy had already begun laying the groundwork for something extraordinary, but he needed the right partners, men with specific skills and unshakable loyalty. That's when Frank Morris arrived. Frank Lee Morris was a bank robber, with an IQ that placed him in the top 2% of the population. He'd already escaped from several federal institutions, though none with the reputation of Alcatraz. At 35, Morris possessed the perfect combination of intelligence, experience, and desperation that Bumpy was looking for. But more than that, he had something even more valuable. He was underestimated by the authorities. The first time they spoke, it was during recreation period in the prison yard. Morris was walking alone near the chain-link fence, staring out at the San Francisco skyline, shimmering in the distance like a mirage. Bumpy approached casually, lighting a cigarette with the practiced ease of a man who'd been doing it for 40 years. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" Bumpy said, his voice carrying that distinctive gravelly tone that had intimidated politicians and police commissioners back in Harlem. "Makes a man dream of freedom." Morris glanced at him suspiciously. In Alcatraz, casual conversations between strangers were rare. Everyone knew who Bumpy Johnson was. Of course, his reputation had preceded him to the Rock. But Morris wasn't the type to be intimidated by legends. "Dreams are dangerous in a place like this," Morris replied carefully. "They make you do stupid things, take unnecessary risks." Bumpy smiled. That cold, calculating expression that had preceded some of the most profitable criminal enterprises in New York City history. "Frank, my boy, you're thinking about this all wrong. Dreams aren't dangerous. Lack of proper planning. Now that's what gets a man killed." Over the following months, Bumpy began educating Morris about what real power looked like behind bars. It wasn't about physical strength or violent intimidation. It was about understanding human psychology, about identifying what people needed and becoming the man who could provide it. It was about building networks, creating dependencies, and establishing yourself as indispensable to the very system that was supposed to contain you. "You see that guard over there?" Bumpy pointed discreetly toward Officer Miller during their third conversation. "He's got troubles at home. Son's mixed up with the wrong crowd in Los Angeles, stealing cars and shooting heroin between his toes. Miller works overtime here trying to pay for lawyers and rehabilitation programs. What do you think would happen if someone could solve his problem for him?" Morris was beginning to understand. "You'd own him." "Ownership is such an ugly word," Bumpy chuckled. "I prefer to think of it as mutual benefit. Miller gets his son back clean and safe. I get a friend in the guard tower who might occasionally forget to lock certain doors or lose track of time during his rounds. Everyone wins." And that's exactly what happened. Through his connections in California, Bumpy arranged for Miller's son to be quietly extracted from his destructive lifestyle, cleaned up in a private facility, and given a legitimate job working construction in Sacramento. The whole operation cost Bumpy a favor owed by an old associate and the promise of future consideration. For Miller, it was a miracle. For Bumpy, it was simply good business. By 1960, Bumpy Johnson had transformed Alcatraz from an impenetrable fortress into his own personal kingdom. He had guards in his pocket, inmates on his payroll, and information flowing through the prison like blood through arteries. When John and Clarence Anglin arrived that summer, the stage was set for something unprecedented. The Anglin brothers were career bank robbers from Florida, strong, loyal, and utterly fearless. They'd worked with Frank Morris before, and trusted him implicitly, but they lacked the sophisticated thinking necessary for what Bumpy had in mind. They were muscle, pure, and simple, perfect for the physical demands of what was to come, but they would need guidance for the intellectual challenges ahead. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said during their first meeting in the prison workshop, "you're looking at this escape business like common criminals. Break out, run fast, hide deep. That's amateur hour. What I'm proposing is something entirely different. We're not just escaping from prison, we're disappearing from the world and reappearing as completely different people. We're not just seeking freedom, we're seeking transformation." The Anglin brothers looked at him skeptically. They'd heard plenty of elaborate escape plans over the years, most of which ended with dead bodies floating in San Francisco Bay. But Morris was nodding slowly, beginning to grasp the scope of Bumpy's vision. "What exactly are you proposing?" John Anglin asked. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with the same intensity that had made him the most feared and respected man in Harlem. "I'm proposing that we don't just escape from Alcatraz, we escape from our entire previous lives. New identities, new backgrounds, new futures, but most importantly, we maintain a connection to something bigger than ourselves. We become part of an organization that spans from coast to coast." That organization, of course, was Bumpy Johnson's criminal empire, which continued to operate across multiple states despite his incarceration. The escape wasn't just about freedom. It was about recruitment. Bumpy was offering Morris and the Anglin brothers the chance to become key players in a sophisticated criminal network that had been generating millions of dollars in revenue since the 1920s. By early 1961, the plan had crystallized into something beautiful and complex. It wasn't enough to simply break out of their cells and swim for shore. They needed to create a complete illusion of presence while establishing a comprehensive system of absence. They needed to fool the most sophisticated prison security system in the world while simultaneously coordinating with criminal associates across the country. The technical aspects of the escape fell primarily to Morris and the Anglin brothers. Using improvised tools stolen from the prison workshop, they would spend months carefully excavating holes in the walls of their cells, concealing their work with fake walls made of cardboard and paint. They would study the guards' routines, memorize shift changes, and identify the perfect window of opportunity for their escape attempt. But the logistical aspects, the real genius of the operation, belonged entirely to Bumpy Johnson. The beauty of Bumpy Johnson's escape plan wasn't in its complexity, it was in its elegant simplicity. While Morris and the Anglin brothers focused on the physical mechanics of breaking out of their cells, Bumpy was orchestrating something far more sophisticated, a complete support system that would ensure their survival and success long after they left Alcatraz Island behind. You have to understand something about the criminal landscape of 1960s America. This wasn't the era of lone wolves and desperate outlaws you see in Hollywood movies. The most successful criminal enterprises operated like corporations, with hierarchies, territories, and sophisticated communication networks that spanned entire regions. Bumpy Johnson had spent 40 years building exactly this kind of organization, and his incarceration hadn't diminished his authority one bit. Through a carefully constructed network of attorneys, bail bondsmen, numbers runners, and legitimate businessmen, Bumpy maintained constant contact with his operations in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Messages flowed in and out of Alcatraz through lawyer visits, carefully coded letters, and bribes to guards who had families facing financial hardship. What the Bureau of Prisons thought was an isolated island fortress was actually a communications hub for one of the most sophisticated criminal networks on the East Coast. The first major component of the escape plan involved establishing safe houses. Bumpy's associates began purchasing properties throughout California using shell companies and false identities. A modest apartment in Oakland, a small house in Sacramento, a fishing cabin near Mendocino. Each location was stocked with cash, clothing, identification documents, and enough supplies to sustain fugitives for weeks. More importantly, each safe house was managed by local operatives who could provide transportation, medical care, and connections to the underground economy that existed in every major American city. But Bumpy's real genius lay in his understanding of human psychology. He knew that the FBI would launch the most intensive manhunt in federal law enforcement history. They would question every known associate, surveillance every possible hideout, and follow up on thousands of false leads. The key wasn't just hiding from the authorities, it was giving them exactly what they expected to find while concealing the truth in plain sight. That's where Allen West came into the picture. Allen Clayton West was a small-time car thief from New York, who'd been transferred to Alcatraz in 1960 after a failed escape attempt from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He was skilled with his hands, particularly when it came to arts and crafts, which had earned him a coveted position in the prison's art therapy program. More importantly, he was desperate for respect and inclusion in something bigger than himself. Bumpy recognized West's psychological profile immediately. Here was a man who wanted to be important, but lacked the intelligence and courage necessary for true leadership. He was perfect for a very specific role in the escape plan: the unwitting patsy, who would misdirect the FBI's investigation while believing he was part of the inner circle. Allen, Bumpy said during one of their conversations in the art workshop, "You've got a talent that could make the difference between life and death for some very important people." West looked up from the papier-mâché project he was working on, a crude sculpture of a seagull that would never be confused with fine art, but showed real attention to detail. What kind of talent, Bumpy? The kind that creates perfection out of nothing. The kind that makes something fake look so real that even experts can't tell the difference. Over the next several weeks, Bumpy carefully explained what he needed: 3 life-size dummy heads that would pass for sleeping prisoners during the morning count. They had to be perfect replicas, complete with hair, skin tone, and facial features detailed enough to fool guards making their rounds in dim corridor lighting. For West, it was the most important project of his life. Finally, someone recognized his artistic abilities. What West didn't fully understand was that he was also being prepared to serve as the fall guy. Bumpy spent hours coaching him on exactly what story to tell federal investigators after the escape. West would claim that he'd been part of the original plan, but had been abandoned at the last minute when his cell wall proved too difficult to breach. He would provide investigators with enough accurate details to establish his credibility while steering them away from Bumpy's involvement entirely. "Remember," Bumpy told him repeatedly, "this was Morris's plan from start to finish. The Anglin brothers were his recruits. I was just another inmate who heard rumors but never got involved. You were the artist who helped because you wanted to be part of something exciting. Can you remember that story, Alan?" West nodded enthusiastically. He was honored to be trusted with such important information, never realizing that his real job was to protect the man who was actually running the entire operation. While West worked on the dummy heads, using a mixture of papier-mâché, paint, and human hair collected from the prison barbershop, Bumpy was coordinating the most complex aspect of the entire plan: the water escape. The official FBI theory, which persists to this day, suggests that Morris and the Anglin brothers attempted to reach the San Francisco shoreline using a makeshift raft constructed from prison raincoats and personal flotation devices. According to this narrative, they most likely drowned in the treacherous currents of San Francisco Bay, their bodies swept out to sea by tides that have claimed hundreds of victims over the decades. The reality was far different and infinitely more sophisticated. Bumpy's contacts in the Bay Area had spent months studying the tidal patterns, current flows, and Coast Guard patrol schedules around Alcatraz Island. They identified a narrow window of opportunity on the night of June 11th when tidal conditions would be optimal and Coast Guard presence would be minimal. More importantly, they positioned a boat in the perfect location to intercept the escapees before they attempted the dangerous crossing to the mainland. The vessel was a 30-foot fishing boat, owned by a legitimate businessman named Thomas Chen, who operated a small charter service out of Fisherman's Wharf. Chen had no criminal background and no obvious connection to Bumpy Johnson. What he did have was a gambling problem and debts to people who worked for Bumpy's West Coast associates. When approached about participating in a special fishing expedition that would clear his debts and pay him $5,000 cash, Chen didn't ask too many questions. On the night of the escape, Chen positioned his boat approximately half a mile northeast of Alcatraz Island, ostensibly conducting a night fishing expedition for striped bass. Coast Guard patrols passed him twice without incident. Just another local fisherman trying to make a living on the bay. Meanwhile, back on Alcatraz, the final preparations were falling into place with mechanical precision. Morris had spent 18 months methodically enlarging the ventilation grill in his cell wall using improvised tools: a metal spoon sharpened to razor sharpness, a coin modified into a scraping device, and a small hand drill constructed from bits and pieces stolen from the prison workshop. Working only at night and concealing his progress behind a fake wall made of painted cardboard, he had excavated a hole large enough for a man to crawl through. The Anglin brothers had accomplished similar excavations in their adjacent cells. But the real artistry was in the details that would buy them precious hours before their absence was discovered. The dummy heads that West had created were masterpieces of deception. Using photographs as reference, he had sculpted faces that captured not just the physical features of Morris and the Anglin brothers, but their sleeping expressions. He had collected hair from the prison barbershop that matched their natural colors and styles. He had mixed paint to achieve skin tones that would look natural under the dim lighting conditions of nighttime cell inspections. Each dummy head was positioned on a pillow, covered partially by a standard-issue prison blanket, and angled to suggest a man sleeping peacefully. From the corridor outside the cells, even a guard with a flashlight would have difficulty determining that he was looking at papier-mâché rather than flesh and blood. The escape route itself, was a marvel of engineering improvisation. After breaking through their cell walls, the three men would climb through the utility corridor behind the cell block, make their way to the roof through a ventilation shaft, descend to ground level using a drainage pipe, and reach the shoreline through a carefully mapped route that avoided guard towers and motion sensors. They had practiced this route dozens of times in their minds, timing each segment and identifying potential problems. They knew exactly how long it would take to traverse each section. They had memorized the locations of security cameras and the patterns of searchlight sweeps. Most importantly, they had identified the precise 15-minute window when guard rotations would create a gap in surveillance coverage. June 11, 1962 fell on a Monday. A choice that wasn't coincidental. Bumpy had calculated that weekend security staff would be replaced by regular weekday guards, creating minor disruptions in routine that could be exploited. Additionally, the weather forecast called for light fog rolling in from the Pacific, which would provide additional concealment for the water portion of their escape. At 9:30 p.m., the evening count was completed, and all prisoners were secured in their cells for the night. The massive steel doors clanged shut with finality, echoing through the corridors like gunshots. For most of the 1,545 inmates on Alcatraz, this was simply the end of another day in their seemingly endless sentences. For Morris, the Anglin brothers, and Bumpy Johnson, it was the beginning of the most audacious prison escape in American history. Bumpy lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the prison settling into its nightly routine. Guards completed their first rounds. Conversations in nearby cells gradually quieted to whispers, then silence. The great machine of federal incarceration shifted into its overnight mode, running on automatic systems and reduced personnel. At 10:15 p.m., Bumpy gave the signal, a barely audible tapping on the wall that connected his cell to Morris's. 3 short taps, followed by 2 long ones. The code they had established months earlier. It was time. Morris removed the fake wall panel that had concealed his excavation work and squeezed through the hole he had spent 18 months creating. The opening was barely large enough for a grown man, requiring him to exhale completely and twist his shoulders at an uncomfortable angle. But he emerged on the other side into the utility corridor that ran behind the entire cell block. John Anglin followed. Then his brother Clarence. Each man carried a small bag containing personal items and supplies that Bumpy had helped them accumulate over the previous months. Flashlights modified to produce minimal light, rope fashioned from torn bedsheets, a waterproof container with matches and emergency food. Most importantly, a detailed map of San Francisco Bay showing currents, depths, and the exact coordinates where Chen's fishing boat would be waiting. The journey through the utility corridor required them to crawl through narrow spaces filled with pipes, electrical conduits, and decades of accumulated dust and debris. They moved in complete silence, pausing frequently to listen for any sounds that might indicate their presence had been detected. Every few minutes they could hear guards making their rounds in the cell blocks above, their footsteps and radio chatter filtering down through the concrete and steel. After 25 minutes of careful navigation, they reached the base of the ventilation shaft that would take them to the roof. This was the most dangerous part of the entire operation. A vertical climb of nearly 40 feet through a shaft barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. If anyone became stuck or made too much noise, the entire escape would fail catastrophically. Morris went first, using a rope and improvised climbing gear to ascend slowly and carefully. The shaft was completely dark, and he had to navigate by feel alone, testing each handhold and foothold before committing his full weight. It took him nearly 15 minutes to reach the roof access point, where he had to carefully remove a ventilation grate without triggering any alarm systems. The Anglin brothers followed, one at a time, with John helping to guide his younger brother Clarence through the most difficult sections. By 11:45 p.m., all 3 men were standing on the roof of the most secure prison in America, looking out over San Francisco Bay and breathing free air for the first time in years. But their ordeal was far from over. The descent to ground level required them to navigate along the roofline, avoiding searchlights and guard towers, before rappelling down a drainage pipe to reach the rocky shoreline at the base of the island. Every step had to be planned and executed with absolute precision. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, would result in capture and probably additional life sentences. At 12:30 a.m., they reached the water's edge and began inflating the life raft they had constructed from prison, raincoats, and personal flotation devices. This makeshift vessel was never intended to carry them all the way to shore. It was simply a means of reaching Chen's fishing boat, which should be positioned approximately half a mile offshore. The water was shockingly cold. Even in June, San Francisco Bay maintains a year-round temperature of around 55 degrees, cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes for anyone not properly prepared. But Bumpy had anticipated this challenge and had arranged for the men to receive additional clothing and waterproof gear through his network of corrupted guards. They paddled away from Alcatraz Island in complete darkness, using a compass and their knowledge of Bay Area geography to navigate toward the rendezvous point. Behind them, the prison continued its normal nighttime operations, unaware that 3 of its most carefully guarded prisoners were disappearing into the fog-shrouded waters of San Francisco Bay. At 1:15 a.m., Chen's fishing boat appeared through the mist like a ghost ship. The transfer was completed in less than 5 minutes. Morris and the Anglin brothers were pulled aboard, their makeshift raft was deflated and weighted down to sink to the bottom of the bay, and Chen began the journey back to shore. But they didn't head for San Francisco. Instead, following instructions that had been carefully coordinated through Bumpy's network, Chen navigated south toward a small marina in San Mateo, where a car was waiting with additional supplies, money, and the first set of false identification documents that would allow the escapees to begin their new lives. Back on Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson lay in his cell and listened to the sounds of guards making their 2 a.m. rounds. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. In approximately 5 hours, the morning count would reveal that Morris and the Anglin brothers were missing, triggering the largest manhunt in FBI history. But by then, his former cellmates would be hundreds of miles away, beginning their transformation from federal fugitives into completely new identities. The morning of June 12th dawned gray and foggy, typical for San Francisco in early summer. Officer Lawrence Bartlett began his morning rounds at 7 a.m. sharp, checking each cell methodically, as he had done thousands of times before. When he reached Morris's cell, he called out the standard morning greeting, "Rise and shine. Morris, time for count." There was no response from the motionless figure on the bunk. Bartlett called again, more sharply this time. "Morris, on your feet." Still no movement. Concerned now, Bartlett used his flashlight to get a better look at the prisoner, who seemed to be sleeping unusually deeply. The beam illuminated what appeared to be a man's head on the pillow, covered partially by a gray prison blanket. But something was wrong. The head was positioned at an unnatural angle, and there was something artificial about the way the hair lay across the pillow. Bartlett unlocked the cell door and stepped inside for a closer examination. What he found was a work of art that would have impressed museum curators, a papier-mâché replica of Frank Morris's head, complete with painted facial features and real human hair, positioned to create the illusion of a sleeping prisoner. It was so realistic that Bartlett spent several seconds staring at it in disbelief before the reality of what he was seeing finally penetrated his consciousness. The alarm that went up throughout Alcatraz at 7:17 a.m. on June 12, 1962, was unlike anything the prison had ever experienced. Within minutes, guards were racing through the corridors, checking every cell, every workshop, every possible hiding place where the missing prisoners might have concealed themselves. The discovery of similar dummy heads in the Anglin brothers' cells confirmed that this wasn't a simple case of prisoners hiding somewhere within the facility. This was a genuine escape, the first successful breakout in Alcatraz's 29-year history as a federal penitentiary. Prison officials immediately implemented emergency lockdown procedures while launching a systematic search of the entire island. Coast Guard vessels were dispatched to patrol the waters around Alcatraz. FBI agents were summoned from San Francisco. Local police departments throughout the Bay Area were notified to watch for suspicious individuals matching the escapees' descriptions. But even as this massive response was being coordinated, Bumpy Johnson was calmly eating breakfast in the prison mess hall, engaging in casual conversation with other inmates, and giving every appearance of being just another prisoner starting another routine day behind bars. When FBI agents arrived to interview him later that morning, they found a 60-year-old man who seemed genuinely shocked by news of the escape and cooperative in answering their questions. Frank Morris seemed like a quiet fellow, Bumpy told them with apparent sincerity. Kept to himself mostly. I had no idea he was planning anything like this. It's really quite remarkable when you think about it. The ingenuity, the patience required to pull off something like this. The agents found his responses helpful, and his demeanor completely credible. Here was a man nearing the end of his sentence, scheduled for parole consideration within 18 months. It made no sense that he would jeopardize his chances of legitimate freedom by participating in a dangerous escape attempt. What they couldn't have known was that every word Bumpy spoke had been carefully rehearsed. Every expression and gesture designed to reinforce the impression of an aging gangster who had made peace with his incarceration and was looking forward to a quiet retirement. The investigation that followed was one of the most intensive in FBI history. Hundreds of agents worked around the clock, following up on thousands of leads and interviewing anyone who had ever known Morris or the Anglin brothers. They reconstructed the escape route, analyzed the makeshift equipment left behind, and studied every aspect of the prison's security procedures. But despite their massive efforts, they found themselves chasing shadows. The trail went cold at the water's edge, and no credible sightings of the escapees ever materialized. The FBI's working theory, that the three men had drowned during their attempted crossing to San Francisco, became the official explanation for their disappearance. What federal investigators never discovered was that their most intensive investigation was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. They were looking for three desperate criminals who had attempted a dangerous water crossing. What they should have been investigating was a sophisticated criminal network that had planned and executed one of the most successful prison breaks in American history. The manhunt that followed the ALCATRAZ escape was unprecedented in the annals of American law enforcement. Within 24 hours of the discovery, the FBI had mobilized resources from 6 regional offices, coordinated with local police departments across 3 states, and launched what would become one of the longest-running investigations in Bureau history. Special Agent in Charge Richard Williams established a command center in San Francisco that operated around the clock, processing leads and coordinating search efforts that stretched from the Canadian border to Mexico. But for all their technological sophistication and unlimited resources, federal investigators were chasing the wrong story entirely. They were looking for 3 desperate fugitives who had attempted a dangerous water crossing in a makeshift raft. What they should have been investigating was the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy ever to penetrate a federal correctional facility. The first major break in the case came 3 days after the escape, when Coast Guard personnel discovered pieces of the Raincoat raft washed up on Angel Island, approximately 2 miles north of Alcatraz. FBI forensics experts confirmed that the materials matched raincoats that had been reported missing from the prison laundry. This discovery seemed to support the theory that Morris and the Anglin brothers had attempted to paddle to the mainland and had most likely drowned when their improvised vessel broke apart in the treacherous currents. What investigators didn't realize was that they had found exactly what Bumpy Johnson intended for them to find. The raft fragments were genuine. They were pieces of the decoy vessel that the escapees had used to paddle away from Alcatraz before transferring to Chen's fishing boat. Bumpy had calculated that some evidence of their water escape would need to be discovered in order to convince authorities that the men had drowned rather than successfully reaching safety. Agent Williams held daily press conferences throughout the first week of the investigation, assuring the public that federal authorities were pursuing significant leads and expected to apprehend the fugitives within a matter of days. Behind the scenes, however, the investigation was proving frustratingly unproductive. Despite interviewing hundreds of witnesses and following up on thousands of reported sightings, agents couldn't develop any credible evidence that Morris and the Anglin brothers had survived their escape attempt. The psychological profiles, developed by FBI behavioral analysts, suggested that the 3 men were desperate criminals who had acted impulsively, motivated by the hopeless desperation that affects long-term prisoners. According to these experts, The escape plan showed signs of hasty preparation and unrealistic expectations about the challenges they would face in the outside world. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the Bureau's chief criminal psychologist, submitted a detailed report, concluding that subjects Morris and Anglin demonstrate classic characteristics of institutionalized individuals who have lost touch with the practical realities of survival outside the correctional environment. Their escape attempt appears to have been motivated by fantasy, rather than genuine preparation for life as fugitives. This assessment was absolutely wrong, but it reflected the fundamental blindness that prevented federal investigators from understanding what had actually occurred. They couldn't conceive that 3 prisoners could have had access to the level of sophisticated support that would be necessary for a successful long-term escape. They couldn't imagine that someone inside ALCATRAZ had been operating a criminal network that extended across the entire country. Most importantly, they couldn't accept that a black prisoner, regardless of his reputation and intelligence, could have orchestrated something so complex and audacious that it made the federal government look incompetent. While FBI agents chased false leads and interviewed witnesses who had seen 3 men resembling the escapees everywhere from Seattle to Miami, the real story was unfolding exactly according to Bumpy Johnson's carefully orchestrated plan. Morris and the Anglin brothers had been transported from the San Mateo Marina to a safe house in Sacramento, where they spent 2 weeks undergoing what amounted to a complete transformation. Professional forgers provided them with driver's licenses, social security cards, and employment records under carefully constructed false identities. A doctor with connections to Bumpy's organization altered their appearances with minor cosmetic procedures that changed the shape of their noses and added realistic scars that would throw off anyone comparing them to their prison photographs. Frank Morris became Frank Mitchell, a construction worker with a documented employment history in Nevada and California. John Anglin became John Anderson, a truck driver with commercial licenses that would allow him to travel throughout the western states without attracting attention. Clarence Anglin became Charles Allen, a warehouse supervisor with references from companies that existed on paper but were actually fronts for criminal enterprises. But the most sophisticated aspect of their transformation involved their integration into legitimate communities, where they could establish normal lives while maintaining their connection to Bumpy's criminal network. This wasn't witness protection. This was something far more complex and effective. Morris was placed in Las Vegas, where the city's rapid growth and transient population made it easy for newcomers to blend in without attracting attention. He worked construction during the day, building the hotels and casinos that were transforming the Nevada desert into America's gambling capital. In the evenings, he managed betting operations for a bookmaking ring that was secretly controlled by Bumpy's East Coast associates. John Anglin was stationed in Phoenix, where he drove trucks for a shipping company that was used to transport both legitimate goods and contraband throughout the southwestern United States. His routes took him through California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, allowing him to serve as a communications link between various components of Bumpy's criminal organization. Clarence Anglin was placed in Denver, where he supervised a warehouse operation that was ostensibly involved in agricultural equipment, but actually served as a distribution center for stolen goods, moving between criminal networks in Chicago, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. Each man was provided with enough money to live comfortably but not extravagantly. They were given detailed instructions about how to behave, how to interact with neighbors and coworkers, and how to avoid the kinds of mistakes that typically led to the capture of fugitives. Most importantly, they were told that their safety and continued freedom depended entirely on their loyalty to Bumpy Johnson and their willingness to follow orders without question. This arrangement continued successfully for exactly 2 years, until the summer of 1964, when Bumpy's larger strategic objective was finally achieved. You see, the Alcatraz escape was never really about freeing 3 prisoners. It was about demonstrating power, establishing credibility, and recruiting a network of operatives who could help Bumpy rebuild his criminal empire when he returned to the outside world. In August 1963, Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz after serving 12 years of his sentence. Federal parole officers noted that he appeared to be a reformed man who had used his time in prison to reflect on his criminal past and prepare for a law-abiding future. He expressed interest in legitimate business opportunities and indicated that he wanted to spend his remaining years as a quiet, productive citizen. What parole officials didn't understand was that they were releasing the mastermind of the most successful prison break in American history. A man who had spent the previous 2 years building a criminal network that stretched from coast to coast. When Bumpy arrived back in Harlem, he discovered that his reputation had grown rather than diminished during his incarceration. Word had spread through the criminal underworld that he had somehow been involved in the Alcatraz escape, though no one knew exactly how. This made him a figure of almost mythical status among criminals who understood that anyone capable of outsmarting federal security could probably help them avoid similar fate. More importantly, Morris and the Anglin brothers had used their 2 years of freedom to establish exactly the kind of criminal infrastructure that Bumpy needed to resume operations on a national scale. They had identified corrupt officials, established money laundering operations, and created distribution networks for everything from stolen goods to illegal gambling. When Bumpy gave the signal in September 1964, all 3 men quietly disappeared from their assumed identities and reported to New York for reassignment within his organization. Frank Morris became Bumpy's chief lieutenant for West Coast operations. John Anglin took control of transportation and logistics for the entire network. Clarence Anglin became responsible for security and intelligence gathering. The FBI continued investigating the Alcatraz escape throughout the 1960s and 1970s, but they were always looking in the wrong places and asking the wrong questions. They assumed that successful fugitives would try to stay hidden and avoid any contact with criminal activities that might attract law enforcement attention. They never considered that the escapees might have become more deeply embedded in criminal enterprises than they had been before their imprisonment. In 1975, the case was officially transferred to the U.S. Marshals Service, which continued following up on reported sightings and developing new investigative leads. Marshals interviewed family members, analyzed prison records, and even consulted with psychics and fortune tellers who claimed to have information about the missing men's whereabouts. But despite decades of investigation and millions of dollars in resources, federal authorities never came close to discovering the truth about what had happened on the night of June 11, 1962. The real irony was that agents spent years investigating Bumpy Johnson's activities after his release from Alcatraz, trying to understand how he had managed to rebuild his criminal empire so quickly and effectively. They documented his meetings, analyzed his financial transactions, and developed detailed organizational charts showing the structure of his various criminal enterprises. What they never realized was that the key to Bumpy's post-prison success was sitting right there in their own case files. The unsolved Alcatraz escape that had provided him with a cadre of completely loyal operatives who had literally risked their lives to serve his interests. Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968, taking his secrets with him to the grave. At his funeral, hundreds of mourners gathered to pay their respects to the man who had been the undisputed king of Harlem for more than 4 decades. Among the crowd were several men whose faces might have looked familiar to FBI agents who had studied prison photographs from the early 1960s. If those agents had thought to attend the funeral of a criminal they considered to be unconnected to their most famous unsolved case. Frank Morris disappeared sometime in the early 1970s, presumably retiring to a quiet life somewhere in the Caribbean or South America. The last confirmed sighting of him was in Miami Beach in 1973, where he was observed having dinner with several individuals who were known to federal authorities as major figures in organized crime. The Anglin brothers continued working for various criminal enterprises throughout the 1970s and 1980s, but they maintained such low profiles that law enforcement agencies never identified them under their assumed identities. John Anglin was reportedly killed in a car accident in Mexico in 1987. Clarence Anglin may have lived until the early 2000s, dying of natural causes in a small town in Brazil where he had established a successful fishing business. Alan West, the artist who had created the dummy heads that made the escape possible, served the remainder of his sentence at Alcatraz and was eventually transferred to other federal facilities. He died in prison in 1978, never having revealed his knowledge of Bumpy Johnson's role in the escape. Whether he took this secret to the grave out of loyalty, fear, or simple adherence to the criminal code of silence, no one will ever know. Today, more than 60 years after the escape, Alcatraz has become one of America's most popular tourist attractions. Millions of visitors take the ferry to the island each year, touring the prison cells and listening to audio presentations that tell the official story of the famous breakout. The National Park Service has done an excellent job of preserving the facility and educating the public about its history as a federal penitentiary. But the story that tourists hear is the sanitized version that federal authorities have always preferred: three desperate criminals who probably drowned while attempting a foolhardy escape in a makeshift raft. The real story, the one that demonstrates how a master criminal could penetrate and manipulate the most secure prison in America, remains hidden in classified files and buried memories. In 2012, the FBI released additional documents related to the Alcatraz investigation, hoping that new information might generate fresh leads in the case. The files contained hundreds of pages of interview transcripts, evidence analyses, and investigative reports. But they also contained something that careful readers might have found intriguing: repeated references to the fact that Bumpy Johnson's criminal activities seemed to expand dramatically after his release from prison, in ways that federal authorities found difficult to explain. The truth is that some mysteries are designed never to be solved. Some crimes are so perfectly executed that they become legends rather than case studies. And some criminals are so intelligent and sophisticated that they operate on a level that law enforcement agencies aren't equipped to understand or investigate. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal. He was an artist whose medium was human psychology and whose masterpiece was the Alcatraz escape. He understood that the most effective way to commit a crime wasn't to avoid detection, but to ensure that investigators would never understand what they were looking for. 60 years later, his masterpiece remains unsolved, misunderstood, and hidden in plain sight. The FBI continues to list Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers as fugitives, though anyone familiar with actuarial tables would recognize that all three men would be dead of old age by now. The case remains officially open, though no active investigation is being conducted. And somewhere in the classified files of the federal government there are probably documents that contain pieces of the truth, fragments of information that, if properly assembled, would reveal how a black gangster from Harlem orchestrated the most audacious prison escape in American history and used it to build a criminal empire that spanned the continent. But those documents will remain classified, and that truth will remain hidden, because some stories are too uncomfortable for official acknowledgement. The idea that America's most secure prison could be penetrated and manipulated by a man that federal authorities considered to be just another aging criminal is not the kind of story that government agencies like to tell. Instead, we're left with the legend: three desperate men who vanished into the foggy waters of San Francisco Bay on a June night in 1962, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered and a mystery that continues to fascinate the American imagination. But now you know the real story. Now you understand how intelligence, patience, and an intimate knowledge of human nature could accomplish what brute force and desperation never could. You've learned how a master criminal could turn America's most secure prison into his own personal kingdom and use it to stage the most successful escape in federal prison history. The next time you see a documentary about Alcatraz or read an article about the famous escape, remember what you've learned here today. Remember that the most important stories are often the ones that never make it into the official records. Remember that truth is frequently stranger, more complex, and more fascinating than fiction. And remember Bumpy Johnson, the King of Harlem, who proved that even behind the walls of Alcatraz, intelligence and determination could triumph over any system that underestimated the power of the human mind.